welcome to Superpowered the Show. I'm Regina Joseph.
And I'm Nick Hare.
And together we'll be bringing you the latest in geopolitics, technology, economics, and any other signals and forecasting trends that we find compelling. So this episode, we are turning our attentions to Paris, France, where the tension is still running rather high over the reverberations of not only the Charlie Hebdo massacre, but also anxiety over immigration and sectarian division in French society, as well as the increasing acceptability of the far right and its views. President François Hollande will soon be facing perhaps the biggest test of his political career during the first week of December. The Paris UN Climate Summit is set to bring the representatives of 198 countries together to agree to a universal and legally binding compact aimed at reducing carbon emissions, contributing to climate change. Viewers of this show may recall an earlier reference to the Paris Climate Summit in our first episode when we referenced the papal encyclical and discussed that as a signal. And we asked the forecasting question back then of whether a comprehensive agreement would be reached. Today we're going to forecast a new wrinkle on the summit event, one that will be occurring in the Paris streets rather than inside the auditorium where the representatives will meet. And this event will probably be giving Hollande his greatest nightmare, the threat by climate change campaigners to blockade the summit with a nonviolent action promised to be the largest in history. Grassroots groups are staging an event called the Climate Games, in which 10 blockades themed around climate red lines activists fear negotiators will cross in the Paris summit. Those blockades will be erected throughout Paris to encourage civil disobedience on a massive scale. And given the existing turbulence in the French body politic, the question we're asking for this episode is, will protests at the UN Paris Climate Summit, known as COP21, will those protests turn violent? And we're setting the threshold for violence at 5 or more fatalities. And to sort of get us started talking about this, France has a strong history of protest actions, and the base rate suggests that the possibility exists that things could easily get out of hand. If you consider approximately about a year ago in November, there was one death at a protest in Paris. Going back to 2005, riots in Paris yielded 3 deaths. And if we go a little further back to 1961, that was the time of the famous Paris massacre, which protesters who were present claim about 200 people were killed, but it took up until 1998 for the French government to at least admit to 40 fatalities at that event. So we know that the fever pitch of sentiment and France's history of protests could actually yield a rather bloody end to the proposed nonviolent civil action. So I'm going to start this forecast off with noting that there's a distinct possibility for some serious trouble. I'm actually going quite cautious on this at a 60% probability, but I think it could easily ratchet up if we see more events as we get closer coming to the first week of December, going against the possibility of reaching any kind of an effective agreement. What's your take on this, Nick?
Well, it's about the probability of some sort of violence erupting which kills 5 or more people. And so the first thing I did was think about which scenarios that might include. And the first obvious one is sort of 5 people dying in separate violence incidents. And the thing is that although people do die in protests, the probability of people dying separately is that relatively rare event times 5. So the idea of 5 separate people dying in separate violence incidents is very, very rare, vanishingly rare. The other type of scenario would be a sort of single incident event which kills 5 or more people. So we could be talking about something where violence causes an indirect effect, so there's a fire that kills people, or a crash or a stampede. But again, these are vanishingly rare outcomes, particularly in developed countries with good crowd control, and Paris has had good crowd control for perhaps decades or centuries. So if it isn't one of those things, then it could be people being killed in an attack. So this would be a terrorist type attack, which might be using firearms or bombs, and the people being killed could be protesters themselves or could be the security forces. So how frequent are those types of attacks? So I had a look at the global terrorist database, and in France since 1972 there have been about 8 terrorist attacks which have killed 5 or more people. So that's about 1 every 5 years. So if we were talking about some random 10-day stretch of time in France somewhere, the probability of a terrorist attack killing 5 or more people would be about 0.5%. So in this case, it's really to do with the fact that, this is a focus for potential violence. Is that going to raise the probability significantly? And my feeling is probably not by much, because for one thing, although the left-wing militant groups do tend to be violent, they don't tend to be deadly. And the other thing is there isn't an obvious counter-protest movement. There isn't a kind of pro-climate change lobby which might field an extremist group who might cause violence and target the protesters. And of course you can contrast that with what happened in Ankara last week, where the protesters themselves were targeted by another extremist group. So my feeling is that, there could be violence, there might be 1 or 2 deaths, but it's very unlikely that we're going to see a 5 or more people being killed. I'm putting a probability of 3% on that outcome. So that is a very significant difference. An order of magnitude separates my probability from yours.
Wow, Nick, that's a really big difference between your forecast and my forecast. One of the things that I find particularly unique about this Paris summit is the fact that it's the nature of the summit itself. And I think when you take that in totality with France's history of not only violent protests that have yielded fatalities, but also if you look at larger global protests against multilateral organizations, the idea of having a series of fatalities taking place over that week-long period in which the summit takes place, is not totally out of line with as a potential black swan event. So it's interesting to see the disparity in our forecasts.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, even if you do get deaths, you've got to realise what the difference is between 1 death happening, which is relatively rare, and 5 deaths happening, because of separate violent incidents. And it's a bit like tossing a coin. Yes, there might be a 50% chance of getting ahead with one toss, but the probability of getting it on 5 separate tosses is 1 in 32. It becomes, once you compound those probabilities, they become very, very small. So my feeling is really the only option for that kind of outcome is an attack. And as I said, I don't think that's the protests are going to be particularly more likely than just your background level there.
And so on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Any additional things you'd like to add, Nick?
No.
Great. So thanks for tuning in to this episode, and tell us what you think might happen at this year's COP21 UN Paris Climate Summit event. Let us know what your thoughts are about the show, about forecasting these kinds of events, and in general, your thoughts, your criticisms, your ideas. And of course, most of all, we really relish your ideas for questions for us to forecast on. And if you're interested, please do send us comments to either our Twitter feed, which is @super_powered, or to our Facebook feed, and we'll be very glad to hear from you. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.